I'm here with Dr. Kayleen Aspa. We just saw the new movie Mary Magdalene with Joaquin Phoenix and Rooney Mara. So it was a very different film, very different from the other films about Jesus Christ I've seen. Can you tell us your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So one of the things that distinguishes this film, which was directed by the director of the Academy Award-winning film Lion, and has a screenplay written by two really quite brilliant women with a literary background, is its emphasis on Mary Magdalene's intelligence, her courage, her dedication, and her compassion. Now, those are actually all qualities that we can see or at least infer from Scripture. This particular film goes back to the essence of who she really was in the Gospel stories.
So the Gospels, you know, that there's a set of Gospels that became the Orthodox Christianity, and it seems like the Mary Magdalene story that was told in the movie was from the Nag Hammadi text, and the Gnostic Gospels has a separate origin, you think?
This film actually takes a number of different sources and weaves them together. If we look at the four canonical scriptures, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that found their way into the Bible as it was canonized in the 4th century, we have a very consistent portrayal of Mary Magdalene. In all four Gospels, we have her role as being the primary witness for the crucifixion and the first witness for the resurrection. Well, that's a role that this film highlights absolutely. In fact, at one point, Joaquin Phoenix says to Rooney Mara, "Mary, be my witness," which is exactly what she was according to Scripture. At the same time, the film also takes elements of historical legend, of aspects about who she was according to oral tradition, and weaves those into the narrative and story. For example, the film opens with her attending to a difficult childbirth. She holds this young woman's face in her hands as she's agonizing, going through labor pains. Well, we don't have anything in the Bible about that, about Mary Magdalene, but we do have this rich oral tradition that found its way into a 13th century story called the Golden Legend. And in that tradition, Mary Magdalene is the patron saint of childbirth. So we can see how that weaves with this story. And you're quite right to note that there are some elements of the so-called Gnostic scriptures that were discovered in the caves of Nag Hammadi that emphasize a very different role for Mary Magdalene, where they actually elevate her role to being the primary, not just witness of Jesus, but the disciple who best understood his message and his teaching. In those texts, which were early Christian texts as well, the first few centuries were when they were written down, they were lost, hidden, and then rediscovered 1,600 years later in 1945 in caves of Nag Hammadi. And in those texts, Mary Magdalene is described as the woman who embodies wisdom, or the woman whose heart is set upon the kingdom more than thy brethren, or the woman who knows all. In those texts, she's not just a disciple, she's actually the one that Jesus designates to be the leader to carry forth his message to the world. And that is very much what we get in this film, is the Mary Magdalene who is empowered to bring his message forth into the world in a way that she understands and the other disciples do not.
In The Last Temptation of Christ, she's depicted as a very sexual adulteress or prostitute. And in this, she's a reverend person, a respectable woman. Tell us more about that.
This is one of the largest misconceptions of who Mary Magdalene was. There's absolutely nothing in the Bible that would suggest that Mary Magdalene was sexualized in any way. That misconception of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute or a sexualized penitent sinner is a mistake that arose in the 6th century when Pope Gregory preached a sermon in which he conflated Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany with an unnamed woman in the Gospel of Luke, who it is suggested might be the carrier of sexual sin. Well, all of those women got conflated and confused in the 6th century, and they really got conflated and confused with a real-life penitent prostitute whose name was Mary, Mary of Egypt. Mary of Egypt was a 4th century woman who, according to legends, had wandered off into the desert after having a moment of conversion. Her story was dramatic and exciting, and it became woven into a fabric with declining literacy where people got very confused. They took Mary of Egypt and confused her with both Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, and Luke's unnamed sinner. Well, ever since that 6th century sermon by Pope Gregory, Mary Magdalene has been identified in the West with sexual sin, with fornication, with adultery, and even with prostitution. That, thankfully, is something that we're finally able to leave behind. And this film is a huge step forward in doing just that. At no point does Mary Magdalene appear in this film in any sort of scandalous or scantily clad way. Rather, the emphasis is on Mary Magdalene as a spiritual seeker, as a disciple of Jesus, and as the courageous and compassionate woman who is his witness to the very end. And that portrayal is actually the most biblically based portrayal of Mary Magdalene that yet exists on film.
And what's so very different in this film, too, is Judas's and Peter's understanding of Jesus' message is so different than Mary Magdalene's.
Absolutely, and that is very grounded in history. We know that there was an enormous expectation in the Jewish community that there would be a Messiah. And that Messiah was anticipated to overthrow the tyranny of Roman rule. In the film, both Peter and Judas expect this political upheaval. They expect an overthrow, a revolution that's an outer revolution. Mary Magdalene's perception of Jesus' message is quite different. She really listens and says, no, the kingdom of heaven is within. It is within us. It is about mercy and forgiveness and being able to live in this world now in a very different way. Well, that message is absolutely underscored in some of these early Christian texts that we find, like the Gospel of Mary, which is reputed to be Mary Magdalene's teaching, and the Gospel of Thomas. In both of those texts, there is this division, this schism between people who are expecting an outer revolution and the interpretation of an inner reorientation. And historically, we might say that Peter's followers were ones who really were expecting that outer social change. And the followers of Thomas and Mary Magdalene were putting the emphasis on an inner awakening. Those divisions, we find, created enormous conflict in the first few centuries of Christian communities. These two very different approaches to what Jesus' message meant.
So you see this sort of mainstream Essene version of apocalyptic vision and political overthrow that's not being communicated in Mary's. It's more of an internal
It's much more a
spirit.
psychological awakening. It's more what we would call a state of enlightenment that is to be sought. In some ways, we might say it feels more Eastern in its orientation.
I was going to say,
yeah. Very much so. And in fact, for people who are not familiar with the Nag Hammadi text, they would perhaps do really well to first look at the Gospel of Thomas, which many scholars think predates Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, probably written around the year 50. Jesus died around the year 33, so it was the earliest. It's a collection of sayings, and very much emphasize this idea that the kingdom of heaven is not what's going to be in the afterlife, after revolution and overthrow, but is about waking up right now, right now. There's a saying that I think Thomas has that is mirrored in the movie quite repeatedly, in that Jesus is asked by his disciples, when will the kingdom of heaven appear? And he answers, the kingdom of heaven is spread out and you do not see it. If you cleave wood, I am there. Lift a stone and you will find me. And in another one of these sayings, he says, if you look for it in the sea, the fish will get there before. If you look for it in the sky, the birds will be there before. Rather, the kingdom of heaven is within you.
Right.
And we have that message repeated throughout the film, as well as in the baptism scenes where both Mary Magdalene and Jesus take people into the water and they say, I baptize you, and to awaken and be ready for the day to come.
Now, is it fair or is it dangerous to say this Gospel of Thomas is more Q, the root source material of Mark and the other three Gospels, the Orthodox Gospels? But is it fair or dangerous to say this is more of the essence of Christianity than the message?
So for our readers, I want to clarify what Q is. Q is a hypothesis by scholars of early Christianity when they looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic gospels. There was a scholarly hypothesis that perhaps all three of them were consulting a book of Jesus's sayings and teachings that didn't have a lot of narrative with it, and that each of those biblical accounts takes some of those sayings and then puts a gloss on it or sets it in a different context depending upon the audience that they were writing for. So this was a scholarly hypothesis until the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 1945. And it is exactly that kind of story that scholars imagined might have been consulted by the writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is simply a collection of sayings. There is no miraculous birth. There, in fact, are no miracles at all. There is no death and resurrection. There is simply the teachings of Jesus. And many people, when they read them for the first time, they say, wow, this is kind of different and startling. This actually sounds a lot like Zen Jesus, these collections of sayings that are sometimes very puzzling. And out of that puzzlement, it's thought that these were teachings that Jesus gave his disciples to contemplate that would help liberate them or lead to a state of enlightenment, like we have in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So as to your question about whether it's more historical or authentic, there are certainly scholars who hold that opinion. The story of the evolution of the Gospels is a fascinating one because we begin with Jesus, who did not write down anything. And his native language was Aramaic, and it would have also been Hebrew, being a pious Jew. There's probably some marketplace Greek that he also spoke, but beyond that, we really don't know. Now, what happened with the Gospels that we have in the Bible over time is that they were redacted, they were changed, there were parts of the story that were inserted and that were taken out and that were altered. We see this process if we compare texts of different centuries. It's really quite an astonishing thing to look at that. And I would recommend that anyone who wants to explore this might consult Jeremy McCulloch's brilliant book, Christianity, the First 3,000 Years, to learn about the evolution of those scriptures. Now, one of the things that's fascinating, though, is that when we're encountering these texts, we have a text that was written in Greek, translated into Latin, then translated into English in multiple versions. So we get very far away from the original, which wasn't in fact in the language that Jesus most likely spoke. When we're talking about Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas is in the Coptic language, which is closest to Syriac, which is the closest surviving language that we have to the language Jesus actually spoke, which would have been Aramaic. In addition, the actual text, the papyrus that we have of Thomas, is very early. If we compare that to something like the Gospel of Luke, the surviving manuscript that we have is so much later, we don't know what the original looked like. And so many scholars think that, the fact that we have this papyrus that's so old and then was hidden and left untouched for 1,600 years means that it has been less altered, less corrupted, if you will, over time. And that's an intriguing idea.